Good morning, everybody. It is so wonderful to be here. I am going to be talking to you today about my book, which, as you can see, is called Higher Ground: How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World. And I'm going to pick up on a lot of themes that we just heard on the last panel, and particularly the other Alison, who just said to you, procurement and supply chain professionals hold the world in their hands. I absolutely agree with this. This, to me, has never been a more exciting, risky, challenging, or opportunity-filled time to work in this profession, and I'm going to explain why. I'm going to spend a little bit of time first talking about why I think it has never been so difficult to run a business, talk about what I think has changed in the world, and then I'm going to talk about what this means for all of you, and then we're going to have a little conversation and maybe take some of your questions. So I would argue, and I argue in the book, and I think we've been hearing about this already this morning, that it has never been such a difficult time to run a business. I spend a lot of time working with CEOs, CFOs, COOs, and this is kind of the picture that I get when I talk to them about the pressures that they're under. And then you can see here on the bottom right of the slide a quote from Ron Williams, who's the former CEO and chairman of Aetna. He's talking to the Wall Street Journal, and this is an article about Disney's challenges in Florida, which I'm sure you all read about. And the argument he makes is that current CEOs who all rose to power because they're operationally excellent are now so distracted by social, political, and yes, environmental issues that running the business is now table stakes. In other words, our senior leaders, and I've been traveling around Europe talking about my book for the last 6 weeks, and I've been hearing it over and over again, when and how we speak up, what positions we take, how we deal with climate, how we deal with immigration and inequality. CEOs are so consumed with these wider social challenges that running the business turns out to be table stakes. People are not able to concentrate. That is a terrifying situation. The other thing I think that is going on, or the way I would summarize this, is that stakeholder expectations of business have never been higher. At the same time, trust has never been lower. So we're in this social media-fueled, hyper-transparent environment where really companies are facing heightened pressure more than they ever have before to address social and environmental issues like racial justice, like child labor, like climate change. At the same time, we trust them less and less to do this. And you can see on this slide a lot of headlines about companies, really being in the spotlight for their negative practices. And there are two here, IKEA and H&M, being in hot water over supply chain allegations, which I find remarkable because IKEA's supply chain program is one of the best in class, and H&M also has, very good transparency, obviously a lot of exposure with fast fashion. But I think the challenge here is that, you can have a best-in-class supply chain program, you can have a best-in-class ESG program. It won't necessarily protect you from reputational risk and reputational scrutiny. We've all read a lot of these press reports about companies, particularly in apparel and food. And you might, I think, as a member of the general public, therefore get the impression that companies in food and apparel are doing a terrible job on supply chain oversight. From my perspective, they're some of the most advanced companies out there. So we have this idea that if we do a good job, there'll be lower reputational risk, but very, very often, and you'll hear this from activists target the best performers because they're trying to move whole sectors, they're trying to tackle these big picture issues, and the effective way you do that is by targeting the leaders. So I think this is making a lot of professionals, a lot of executives very nervous and feeling like they need to put their head below the parapet and hope that these, a lot of these pressures don't hit them. But that is not, in my opinion, the right way to go, and I'm going to explain why. Companies where I live in New York and in the US, and we've just been hearing about the upcoming election in the US, which is, I can assure you, even less fun than the upcoming election here. So are really, really feeling trapped sat between these two very polarized forces. I'm sure you know that America is extremely polarized, and it is not just the case now that we say as American citizens, I disagree with you, but I can still have a civil conversation with you. Increasingly, the political atmosphere is, I disagree with you, and I think you must be evil and stupid, and I don't want to talk to you. And companies, I think, are really like this picture of the ship going through the rock and the hard place, trying to manage these pressures. And from spending time in Europe and the UK, I think these pressures are increasing, here too. So it is not just an American problem. But we can see here we've got a camp on the right in the US really saying that ESG is woke, ESG is stealth socialism. Here we have a headline from Mike Pence, the former vice president. The progressive left is using this to advance goals it could never hope to achieve at the ballot box. So the message there is just go back to basics, forget about all this environmental, social stuff, stick to shareholder value. Well, that's not viable. Good luck attracting and retaining anyone under 30 if you're going to try and take that 20th century position. On the other hand, on the left, with the pro-sustainability crowd, who I spend a lot of time with, we now really have this expectation, nothing you do will ever be good enough. And I really was struck by the example of Patagonia. I'm sure you know, the founder of Patagonia just handed over ownership of his business to a charity. Incredible leading company, a sustainability poster child. You can see here, still getting negative press reports on plastic. And then on my social media feed, took a few hours before I saw people saying, well, it's just tax avoidance. Well, the business model's still based on plastic. Well, they're not giving employees a stake. And so you can be doing the best possible job out there. And I think we need to be clear, it won't protect us necessarily from the reputational pressures and the volatility. And so for many leaders in the US, they're really struggling because there's an anti-ESG camp saying, stop all this stuff, stop the diversity efforts, stop the ESG efforts, go back to basics. And then there's a group of people on the other side where nothing you ever do will be going far enough. You do a good job in one area, you'll get criticized in another area. You do a good job on scope 3, you're going to get criticized on human rights. And so the level of expectations, I think, is unprecedented. And a lot of companies are managing this in entirely the wrong way by focusing on their messaging, focusing on reputational risk management, and not really getting into the guts of the business and changing how they do things. So for Bud Light, they launched a campaign with a transgender influencer. There was then a very organized backlash, right-wing backlash on social media. And rather than steering into the skid, saying this is our brand values, we're going to stick to this, the CEO apologized and fired the marketing manager. And then literally everybody is angry with Bud Light. And so you face a problem, trying to keep, out of the headlines. You face a problem managing these pressures. You face many, many problems with our rising expectations as a society. And I think we need to ask how we got here. How did we get to this place that we find ourselves in 2024? And I think there are 3 reasons, all of which are extremely significant for the people in this room. The first, I would call how transparency became a weapon. Back in the 20th century, there are a few TV stations, there are a few newspapers, they both need the advertising. Companies can control, to a much greater extent than they can today, what we see and hear about what they are doing. So if there's a big environmental disaster like Exxon Valdez, companies will be in the spotlight. But otherwise, you can control your reputation, you can keep secrets, you can, to a great extent, control the narrative. Clearly, that's not the case anymore. We don't take a company's word for anything. We look at other reviewers to figure out where to work, what to buy, where to go on holiday. So in a very, very real sense, corporations have been forced into a much more interactive and dynamic relationship with a much bigger group of stakeholders, obviously including suppliers. An even more interesting trend, I think, is what I call leaking is the new whistleblowing. So we now have young people coming into the workforce, they're savvy on social media, they've grown up in a very different environment that I have grown up in. And they're far less likely to call the internal hotline to raise concerns, and far more likely to put their issues out there on social media and to try and hold the company accountable in new ways. So we now have very often groups of young people that are angry, they're upset, they care about the environment, they care about all these environmental and social issues. They don't know how to hold their employers accountable, and so they leak damaging information into the public domain. The latest thing in the US has been, there have been a lot of layoffs, young employees filming themselves being laid off and then putting it onto TikTok. McKinsey's just been fined $768 million for working for both the FDA and Purdue Pharma during the opioid crisis. We know that because a young employee leaked pitch decks to the New York Times. And then we saw the chairman and CEO of KPMG in January 2021 gave a town hall talk, which of course was on Zoom. It was in the middle of the pandemic. And he said, for reasons I can't fully explain, I think unconscious bias training is crap, and I'm going to carry on meeting my clients even though it's COVID. That was in the Financial Times the next day, and he lost his job. So to a very great extent, we can't keep secrets. We need to assume that anything we say or do internally might become public knowledge, and that puts companies under an unprecedented level of pressure. The second thing that has happened is that business has become, or has been dragged into, in many cases, much more involved and aware of geopolitical crises. It is no longer possible to say, we just ignore politics, we focus on shareholder value, we don't break the law. Companies have been certainly drawn into these polarized dynamics in the US. Of course, we all know many companies under pressure to pull out of Russia after Putin invaded Ukraine. What's on my desk at the moment is enormous amounts of turmoil over Israel and Palestine. And everywhere I've gone throughout Europe, there have been student protesters. So there is an expectation now that business should not remain neutral, but should take positions on where and how it operates based on ethical considerations. And as you will all know, with global, complex, interconnected supply chains, that becomes fiendishly difficult. You withdraw from one market, there will be questions about what you are doing in another market. And then questions, if you do withdraw, over whether that's ethical as well. Many companies pulled out of Myanmar, for example, after the latest coup, having all gone in there after it loosened up, and then faced pressure over skyrocketing female unemployment and who they sold their assets to. So divesting, trying to be defensive, isn't necessarily the answer either. And there is a global story here. So this is from a think tank in the US who say that between 2009 and 2019, popular protest, and what I mean is people on the streets angry with the government, rose by 11.5% a year. We have not been in this era of popular protest since the late 1960s, and I think this last line is a kicker. While each protest has a unique context, common grievances overwhelmingly center on perceptions of ineffective governance and corruption. So pretty much no matter where we are, where we live in the world, whether we're in a democracy, whether we're in an authoritarian country, whether we are in the developed or developing world, we're angry with the government. We don't trust them to provide social services, opportunities for our children, good jobs. And a lot of that anger against the government, I think, has hit business simply because we have nowhere else to go. We don't trust government to solve our problems anymore, so we are now relying on business to take on questions that we used to rely on regulators to take on. And then many of these challenges, like inequality, like climate change, are also global in reach and scale. And many point out, quite rightly, that only business has the reach and scale to work across borders and to take on these challenges. But that doesn't mean, of course, it's easy. And then finally, and we heard a lot about this in the last panel, people's nephews and nieces and grandchildren were discussed very extensively. Young people have very different expectations of what work should provide and what companies should be there for. I hear it over and over again in the classroom. I need my work to have meaning. I need my work to have value. I teach required ethics and sustainability classes. I will say every MBA student that I have in my classes who is working in procurement and supply chain comes to me to want to talk about how they can move into supply chain sustainability, how they can drive change. So you now have this group of young people. They are warriors on this stuff. If you are under about 28, you do not remember corporate culture before the pandemic. We are reshaping culture and businesses' expectations in real time, and there will be young people, young graduates coming into your company that care deeply about ESG issues. They don't see this as a fad or a trend or an optional thing or a nice to have, and they are going to try and hold you accountable if they don't hear what you like. But that is also a huge opportunity of passion and energy to get some of these things done. There's also a lot of challenges with mental health, with expectations of leadership. We need, I think, to move in general, and I'm going to come back to this, from the idea that you bark orders from the top, you set incentives, you roll out decisions, and more to this sense of influencing, to building relationships, to mentoring, to bringing people along with you, because the young people in my classroom think about their careers entirely differently from how I thought about my career when I was young. And so, if we're in responsible business, if we're in supply chain and procurement, we're really facing this risky new world where the call is coming from inside the house. You can't necessarily defend your reputation with good stories, with reputational risk management, with getting a better ESG score. You have to engage and focus and have answers to some of these big, intractable problems, which none of us yet have the answer to. And so we need to stop treating our ethics and sustainability efforts as a defense mechanism. We need to stop treating corporations like black boxes, because we're in a new world where we can't say, here's the corporation, here's wider society. We need to understand that our corporations are part of society. If there's political turmoil, social turmoil in the world, that will show up inside the corporation. But that is not the same thing as saying business needs to take on and solve all these incredibly intractable, difficult problems. What it does mean is that we need focus and honesty and real strategic thinking about the way forward. And so we've seen over the past decade, I find this graph really remarkable. I think this is a really good one-slide explanation for the rise of ESG. Back in 1975, if you were running a business, the vast majority of corporate value sit in tangible assets. By that, I mean things we can see and touch and feel: buildings, equipment, inventory, cash, bonds, land, factories. Fast forward to 2020, as much as 90% of corporate value now sits in intangible assets. By that, I mean things like patents and IP, brand value, customer data, software, network effects, essentially stakeholder trust, essentially perception of what your business thinks, and of course, your relationships, not least your relationships across your supply chain, are incredibly important here. They're an incredible source of influence, also an incredible source of risk. So we're in the era of the intangible company. We all know we're all working much more remotely than we used to. The physical boundaries around our working lives have dissolved. The time boundaries around our working lives have dissolved. There's data from Microsoft showing that many of us, we work all day, we go home, we cook dinner, we look after the kids, and then we go back online late at night to finish off our work. They found this third peak during the day. So we can no longer create a boundary, a time boundary around our working lives. Corporate confidentiality is no longer assured because leaking is the new whistleblowing. We can't keep secrets via legal agreements in the same way. Leaders are grappling with shifting status and power boundaries because young people are far more willing to speak up and try and hold leaders accountable on these questions in very, very new ways. And then here is the real kicker, I think, for supply chain professionals. We have collectively, as a society, moved since the 1980s to this idea that you are now, as a lead multinational, responsible for what goes on in your supply chain. You're responsible for tackling climate change, child labor, human rights abuses, And the problem may be 6 tiers down. The problem may be a guy with the mobile phone in some remote part of the world. You can't do due diligence on that. You can't audit that. There aren't good answers to when and how we operate and how far we need to go to solve some of these intractable problems. But yet, the public and employees and the general, population is understanding and holding you responsible for solving challenges we do not yet know how to solve. And then more broadly, as we see the shift from shareholder value to stakeholder capitalism, that raises enormous challenges for people in this function for how you deal with and manage and prioritize your relationships. So what does this mean for supply chain and procurement leaders? It's clearly a time of enormous change. It is, I think, a time where it has never been so possible to reimagine this function as the strategic real leadership point that it needs to be. And so I think we all have an imperative to help CEOs focus, to consider this new landscape and to make our way through this in a way that is realistic, that doesn't involve overpromising, greenwashing, all that kind of thing, but at the same time makes it clear that we cannot influence everything. I spend a lot of time working with the FT, and I was on a panel with Sarah Murray, who is an FT journalist, and she spoke about revelations about child labour in the supply chain that she had covered as a journalist back in the 1990s, featuring Nike and The Gap. And she said how striking it was, how little the conversation has moved on. Our expectations are higher, but we still seem to be, I think, struggling to manage this world in an era of really elevated expectations. Suppliers are still challenged with inconsistent expectations from buyers, an excessive focus on proximate causes rather than root issues, limited benefits designed from the audit system, lots and lots of companies spending enormous amounts of money on the audit system, workers still not meaningfully engaged, and insufficient enforcement of laws by the government. If you're a buyer, you're struggling to understand where to focus when audit provides an incomplete picture. There are questions about the integrity of results, about the cost, and there's a lack of positive narrative and stakeholder credibility. And I think the people in this room can help drive this transformation and think about this in a new way. I'm about to show you a slide about human rights regulation and expectations. Just brace yourself for this slide. I think this is an incredible picture of how the world has changed for the people in this room. So here, this is the mess of laws that we have seen popping up, all of which affect the supply chain since 2000. So we can see here, a few things coming into force after 2000. 2016 onwards, you can see in so many countries of the world, there is a focus on worker rights, on transparency, on child labour, on supply chain oversight, on gender, on conflict minerals, on ethnic minorities, on mining, on labour. So you are now at the nexus of this, this mess of regulation. And in some cases, these issues directly contradict. Lots and lots of companies I'm working with at the moment having a real challenge because they're now being forced to do lots and lots of very deep due diligence if they want to work in China, and then products have been banned from Xinjiang. You can't even do that auditing and due diligence without breaking Chinese espionage laws. So this idea we just focus on the black and white picture of not breaking the law is no longer viable when this mess of laws start to contradict each other. There are all these rising expectations. There's going to be more and more and more enforcement, and all of this puts supply chain and procurement professionals front and center. So we're seeing many fundamental changes in how companies think about and reorient themselves around these challenges. The landscape of sourcing countries is shifting as China becomes more expensive and morally fraught. Automation is taking root. Lots of companies nearshoring, reshoring. I was very interested to see the discussion in the last panel about having more suppliers because many of the companies I work with are trying to rather reduce their supply chains, reduce their number of relationships so they can have the depth. But there are those real trade-offs. You have more breadth, you've got more exposure to more parties, you have more depth, you've got more of your eggs in one basket. The regulation of supply chain practices is coming. I don't think most companies in Europe are ready for the CSDDD, and we can imagine enormously more increased pressure on forced labor, on human trafficking, on child labor, and then needing to navigate the nexus of that and the pressure to tackle scope 3 is perhaps the biggest strategic challenge out there for many of the companies that I work with. Workers now have the ability to communicate their needs and concerns directly with each other and with the wider world. If you have a smartphone, you can capture evidence of poor working conditions and give it to activists, give it to NGOs, give it to the public domain. So lots more tools about worker voice, worker engagement. We can't rely on audits. We need to get that primary data, and we need to understand that those workers will be using their voices and will be trying to hold you accountable. And then there are rising expectations more broadly and stakeholder expectations for corporate action on climate change, on sustainable development, which has direct, immediate implications for supply chain practices and disclosure. So companies as a whole want to move beyond a compliance approach, tricky given that nexus of regulation I just showed you, and towards systemic change and net positive impacts. They have teams of young people wanting to help, but let's be clear that this is fiendishly challenging and going to remain so. So for supply chain sustainability, we're seeing a brave new world, perhaps. In the 90s, it was all about codes and compliance. Procurement's tactical. We focus on cost. Global outsourcing is the norm. In the 2000s, we start to see the rise of the chief procurement officer. We start to see thinking around supply chain oversight as a driver of strategic business value. We start to see supply chain finance models emerging. But now, as we're more transformed, more digital, in a more transparent and fraught world, we know the risks. We know the pressure on scope 3. We know the pressure on geopolitical shifts. The onus on us, I think, is to say there are no easy answers and to help the senior executive teams navigate through this swamp and to something clearer and more focused and onto higher ground. So the risk and opportunity for supply chain professionals is higher than ever. The imperative for supply chain leaders, I think, is to reimagine your roles as more senior and strategic. There was a point on the last panel hearing what people wanted to focus on in the next year. Sustainability came top, but also leadership, relationship management, and collaboration. And those 4 areas come together. To me, this is the perfect time to sit next to the CEO and think about how are we going to manage our relationships? How are we going to manage where and how we operate? Are we going to reduce our number of relationships? Are we going to spread our risk? How are we going to manage these reputational pressures? How are we going to talk to the public and ill-informed journalists who think we can just solve child labor like that? How are we going to explain in this world of very high expectations that we need to take a nuanced and focused path through here, and really that there is an opportunity to lead as never before, but the CEO has never needed your help as much as they do today. So a terrifying world, perhaps, an exciting world full of opportunity, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation now. Thank you.